Good morning and welcome to Sunday Coffee, Art, Design, and Architecture. We are coming to you from Florida, overlooking the gentle lapping waves of the Gulf of Mexico. My motivation for this podcast channel is to broadcast good news stories, interesting people, and food for thought. So pour yourself a nice hot cup of tea or coffee, take a deep breath, get cozy, and enjoy a break for some uplifting conversations. Today, my guests are Lorraine Johnson and Shelia Colla, and the book is A Northern Gardener's Guide to Native Plants and Pollinators, Creating Habitat in Northwest, Great Lakes, and Upper Midwest, published by Island Press in 2023. So, good morning, ladies, and welcome to the show.
Good morning.
Thanks so much for having us.
Well, I always ask my guests first thing is, so what are we having this morning? Tea or coffee? What's in your cup?
I'm a cappuccino girl. I was on the search for the perfect cappuccino.
And I've already had 3 cups of espresso today, so I'm having a lovely glass of tap water.
What's always interesting to find out what my guests like to drink on a Sunday morning. That's funny. So we're going to race through this with cappuccinos and espressos. Well, I'm just having like a little cup of chai and just getting awake here. So, well, my first question is, and we'll take turns going back and forth. What was your motivation for writing this particular book?
Sheila, why don't you start?
Sure. So Lorraine Johnson and I go pretty far back. I've been working on bee decline to pollinator decline for almost 20 years now. And Lorraine and I live in the same city. And we just started, crossing paths at different conferences and presentations and things. And we kind of just were on the same page. We really always tried to focus on native bees, native plants, and thinking about things in terms of supporting natural ecologies and ecological integrity and thinking about climate change. And there's a lot of stuff out there about bee declines, but a lot of it does kind of mix up maybe managed European honeybees, like managed bee issues, beekeeper issues versus wild pollinator issues. So we really wanted to write this book to describe some of the complexity around thinking about native species and, how much there is to learn still around relationships that native plants and native insects have and how complicated things are, but also how we're in a position where we can actually support these relationships.
Yeah, everything that Sheila's talked about, really resonates. And, I've just admired Sheila's work for such a long time. And the chance to work with, a scientist who is, doing research and a bee specialist and a conservation biologist such as Sheila. Um, it was such a great opportunity. I've been writing books about native plants and restoring habitat and kind of what individuals and community groups can do to support, ecologies and native plants and the relationships between native plants and all other aspects of a place, the wildlife, conserving water and other resources and that sort of thing. So I've been working in this area and writing books about this for about 30 years, but this has just been, a joy to collaborate together on this book with Sheila and to work with such an incredible scientist and advocate. My motivation was, all of those things that Sheila talked about, and then just the incredible opportunity to work with Sheila and to also connect with the incredible interest there is out there in pollinators right now. And as Sheila says, to try to kind of get at the complexities, correct some of the misinformation that's out there, and try to spread good information and be very clear about the issues. So that was the idea with the book.
Well, I was intrigued. On the forward, he wrote a phrase that says, what happens in Vegas doesn't stay in Vegas. And I think that many residential, property owners sit and think, well, what I do on my property doesn't affect other people. But can you both talk about, that's really not true, that what we do here at my house is going to affect not only everybody else's, but the whole chain. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, we were so honored that Douglas Tallamy, just a revered entomologist and author of many books, we were just so honored when he agreed to write a foreword for our book. And that quote you just read about, the fact that we are all connected and what we do as individuals really can make a difference, particularly when what we're doing connects others with what other people are doing. And, if we're not only restoring yards where we might live or balconies where we might live, but also getting engaged in community projects so that these habitats are no longer fragmented but are actually connected. That's one of the ways that, or that's one of the things that I think is really important to stress. And in many ways, I think our book is primarily about relationships, actually. I think that's one way to think of what we've done in this book. We focus on the relationships between native plants and pollinators and some of the specialist relationships. We really focus on that, but it's also about the relationships that we might have as humans with the places where we live or the ecologies of, that make the place where we live unique, or the relationships we have with what's happening in our communities and how habitat regeneration connects with that and can connect with all kinds of other bigger issues, or those are the big issues, but some of them. So I really think we're not, that Douglas Tallamy quote really highlights nothing we do is in isolation. Everything we do has consequences, and our book is about how to make the consequences of our landscape and gardening choices, how to make those positive and to contribute to the nature of which we are a part as humans. We are part of nature as humans. So the book is about relationships.
Yeah, so I can maybe speak to it a little bit from a bumblebee's perspective. We have in North America about 50 species of native bumblebees, and we think at least a quarter, if not a third of them, are at risk of extinction. So bumblebees are important native pollinators, especially in temperate zones. So like the Northeast, the Great Lakes region, the places that Lorraine and I were sort of talking about, the Midwest, especially along hilly and montane areas as well. And they use landmarks on the ground to forage. So they do something that we call trap lining. So they'll decide on a flower, they'll learn a flower. So let's say it's like common milkweed, and they'll basically memorize where the common milkweed is in within, I don't know, 1 or 2 kilometers. And they'll just go in a circuit and they'll just visit all of the common milkweeds. And if only one person is planting milkweeds, then there's probably not going to be enough for that bee to do that foraging trip. So what we need is a few people in the neighborhood to plant milkweed so it's blooming at that time, and then to plant another plant that might bloom afterwards, like echinacea or goldenrod, because then the bee, once the milkweed stops blooming, it learns another flower. And bumblebees are very flower constant, so they don't switch from plant species to plant species. They tend to learn how to use one type of flower and then they stick to that flower, which makes them amazing pollinators because then those pollen grains are not being dropped off on the wrong flower. So there's all these things around like bee behavior and ecology that we're thinking about. And when people plant even just one, aster in their yard or one serviceberry tree or what have you, if there are enough in the general vicinity, then you're really supporting these behaviors that you don't even know are happening.
Well, I thought that was interesting too. Is the myth that you talked about in the book about how much bees pollinate? So, how much of our crops are really pollinated by bees?
I'm not sure we know specifically for bees. It's been estimated that it's about one third of our food, which is the minority, but it is the stuff with the most vitamins. So it tends to be like the fruits, the vegetables, the spices, apples, berries, tomatoes, peppers, all of those things. What's not pollinated by animals like wheat and corn and rice and that kind of thing, which are the bulk of our diets, but not the like tasty parts, the spicy part. In Canada and the US, bees are the most important pollinator group. We have 2,000 species in North America, and we know that they have really intricate relationships. But then there are also other pollinators like hummingbirds, flies, butterflies, beetles, even. And as you go into South America, you see a switch to even bats and more hummingbirds and that kind of thing. So we can't just like say that bees are doing all of the work, but we can say that in parts of like Canada and the US, that bees are the most important pollinating group.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll back up a minute. Do you mean flies can pollinate?
Yeah, they're actually really, really important pollinators, especially if you go into like the tundra in the north. And even now, as we get into fall, you'll see that there are more flies out sometimes than bees. Sometimes bees are a little bit more fair weather animals. You see them more when it's sunny out. But flies are pretty hardy and they'll move around pollen grains as well. There are flower flies, serpent flies, and yeah, they're also really, really important pollinators and not given a whole bunch of credit.
Wow, I had no idea. So I'm going to feel bad when I swat a fly next. Well, now I'd like to also talk about you for the audience. This book is beautifully illustrated. Can you tell us a little bit more about Anne? I believe her name is Anne Sanderson. How did she choose the flowers and the process to illustrate all these everything beautiful in this book?
You've worked with Anne before, haven't you, Sheila? Quite a bit, and I think Anne came to us via your
Yeah.
connection and your history working with her. Yes.
Yeah, so we actually did our undergrad degrees in zoology together. So that's how I knew Anne. And then she went off to, I believe it was California, to do specifically zoological illustrations. And it was pretty hard to find someone who knows, like, when you're drawing insects, to think about things like wing veins and hairs on different parts of the body is like very small minute details. And after working with Anne for a few brochures and things, I knew that she was into this kind of thing, but also her work is so beautiful. And in terms of the plants, Lorraine really led that, so I'll let Lorraine answer about the plant
Yeah.
selections there.
Well, I was just amazed by the way that Anne Sanderson, in her illustrations for the book, could capture the essence of a plant without necessarily including all of the details, as she does often in the insect and animal illustrations. In the flowers, she captures the she captures the whole feel of the flower as well as having the important details. That's my reaction to Anne's gorgeous work. I think it's incredible what she does, and I think she's just such an important part of making this book what it is.
Yes, I think that it attracts humans to the book. It's so beautifully laid out. How long did it take you to compile and to put together a book like this?
We actually started this. It's kind of funny in that we were first talking about doing a brochure for the city we live in. Live in Toronto, and we thought, we proposed to the city of Toronto that we could write a brochure on the subject of gardening for the rusty patch bumblebee, and for the city who does a lot of work around native plants and pollinators, was very supportive of this idea of the brochure and encouraged us and said, yes, the city would publish it. So we got to work on it. And then it just kept getting bigger and bigger, and to the point where the nonprofit environmental organization Friends of the Earth in Canada agreed to publish um, a longer version of our original idea of a brochure. So that I can't remember how many pages that was. Sheila, do you recall the first kind of extended version of this?
I think it was about 25 pages.
Yeah, and then we said, we've got so much more material. This this is a book, and then the publishers got involved, and that was amazing. And so, but I have to say, there was more material that we could have included. We had to kind of take out a few plants. And even so, it's a big and comprehensive book. I can't remember the exact number of pages right now, but comprehensive, extensive book that started out with the kernel of an idea of a brochure, and then just kept growing.
255 pages worth.
Yeah.
Well, I
And
just checked too. Like, yep.
yeah, and I think we profile like in detail, and with Anne Sanderson's beautiful illustrations, and then also photographs. I think we profile more than 300, and it must be close to 350 plants in a lot of detail. With how to grow them. Native plants, how to grow them, where they grow, what they need, all of this specialist relationships they have with pollinators, like the pollen specialist bees or the butterflies and moths for which the plant is a larval host. Like we go into quite a bit of detail about certainly more than 330 plants. And then we mention dozens more, just kind of, and if you're interested in this plant, you might be interested in this other plant as well. There's a lot of material covered in this book.
Yes, I like it. It's a real how to do it guide. You've got a lot of like plans in here. Like some people, sometimes it's a little overwhelming. Tell us about some plants that can go together, get along together, and attract pollinators. How does all that work?
Yeah, we did. We did provide suggestions of good combinations of native plants as well. In each of the plant profiles, we include companions. Really, I think of them as companions, and these might be plants that grow together in the wild, so that you would see in a natural ecosystem, or some other relationship that they have. I think we have to mention, Sheila, I'm sure you'll concur, we have to mention the amazing kind of companionship of goldenrod and asters. And these are plants that not only often grow together in natural habitats you might see in the wild, they look amazing together, and both of them are powerhouses in terms of pollinator support. Just incredibly valuable to pollinators.
For goldenrod and asters in late fall, they are pretty simple flowers, so lots of different types of pollinators can visit them. They don't require kind of like a bottled gentian where a bee has to like learn how to get in there and open up the flower. They're just kind of open flowers, so lots of insects can walk around and get what they need. And this is important because they grow in these large numbers, or at least they're supposed to if they're given enough space. In North America, our insects largely sleep over the winter. Of course, the monarch butterfly is an exception because they're stocking up on goldenrod nectar to make their way south towards Mexico over the Great Lakes and through the Midwest. Pretty long journey those monarchs have. So having goldenrod is actually an important food source for them for their migration. But most of our other insects actually sleep over the winter. None of our insects actually make honey. So the European honeybee stores honey for the winter and then they stay awake and they eat the honey. But our insects need to feed, and then they sleep and they live off of their fat bodies. So these late fall plants are the last chance that they have to build up these fat bodies, which then take them over the entire winter until they emerge in the springtime.
Well, let me ask a devil's advocate question. So, why are native plants really important in the first place? I mean, why can't I just go to the nursery and buy whatever I want because it's pretty and put it in my yard? Why don't they just like whatever I buy? I mean, I go to the fridge and I just pick out whatever I like. What's special about the relationships between native plants and bees and the birds?
Yeah, I'd say that in a lot of cases, which we try to describe, I think, in the book, is that we don't know everything yet. So, in some ways, we have to kind of just support these relationships that go back in evolutionary time from before we were even here, because we don't actually understand how these relationships all come together. And one example is there's been this No Mow May campaign in North America where people are talking about, letting dandelions bloom to support native pollinators. And it is true that they do produce some nectar that pretty much any, pollinator out in the springtime will probably drink if they have to. And it's fine. Sugar water is sugar water. But there was a study that fed bumblebee queens, which are on the verge of starvation when they come out of hibernation before they start their colonies, dandelion pollen versus prunus pollen and salix pollen, so willow and different fruit tree pollens. And the bumblebee queens that were fed only dandelion actually ended up eating their own eggs because dandelion pollen is very low in protein. Something like honeybees, which have co-evolved with dandelions in their native ranges, would be okay with that because they already have their colonies all set up. So they really just need the sugar. But for the early emerging bumblebee queens that need protein to start being able to lay eggs, to start getting their colonies out there and foraging, the protein is more important than the sugar. So by promoting, dandelions above something like a willow tree, we're actually kind of messing with relationships and timing of things in a way that maybe we don't really fully understand. And I think there's probably tons of examples like that. And then we also have a bunch of specialists, butterflies, where the caterpillars rely on certain families or genera of plants, and bees, which are also they're very specific in terms of which pollen they take, either from plant families or plant genera. So there's actually quite a few species that are very specific. So when you plant something like goldenrod, there are bees that are completely reliant on goldenrod pollen, for example. And it's just this is some of the complexity that we were trying to communicate. Sure, if you plant lavender, gardens are spaces that people have to enjoy too. I love lavender. I love lilacs. I get it. You can plant those, and bees will definitely visit them. But what we're asking people to do is think about supporting these coevolutionary relationships that are happening sometimes at the microbial level that we're just starting to understand. Another example is bee medicines. So there was a study on turtlehead that showed that bumblebees that have high disease loads will feed off of turtlehead, which have chemicals in the nectar that lower parasites. And there's some evidence now that bee balm also does the same thing. So having these native plants out there for bees who are sick to be able to choose from is really important, but we wouldn't even know that we were doing it. So we just kind of have to err on supporting the plants that were here on the land before we were, and seeing if we can support those relationships in those ways.
What we focus on in the book, supporting these relationships, I think it's so crucial. And I also think for gardeners who might be asking themselves, why should I plant native plants? The example Sheila used, I like lavender, I like lilacs. Sure, plant those. We're not suggesting anybody has to get rid of all their non-native plants. It's more a matter of, look, if when you plant native plants, you can support all of these relationships. So, let's consider that. Let's make room. Let's include that. But then also just for gardeners, in this era of climate change and so many stresses on the environment, gardening with native plants, it can be amazing to see the way these co-evolved species require less in the way of inputs. They've adapted to the conditions. If you're planting native plants in the area where they've evolved, they tend to require less in the way of watering. They certainly don't require any chemical inputs, synthetic chemicals. There is no need or reason to apply synthetic fertilizers or pesticides when you're gardening with native plants. So these are all some of the other advantages and reasons why gardeners might want to, gardeners who hadn't considered native plants before, along with, this idea of the incredible importance of native plants to native pollinators and those supporting those co-evolved relationships. Along with that, there's just some very also kind of benefits around resource conservation, connecting you with your home place and what makes it special, like really kind of inhabiting the place where you are and being in a kind of relationship with that place by growing the plants of that place and supporting, the relationships around those plants. Those are some of the other kind of reasons gardeners might want to consider embarking on a native plant habitat journey.
Okay, I liked you had a question in a book, and it was why do they get attracted to non-native plants too? Because they'll be on those, and I guess they're just starving, or why would they even go to the non-native plants? Because they have no other option.
Yeah, I guess it's a couple things. Sometimes, like I said, bumblebees like will learn a certain plant. So for them, if there's a non-native plant that's very abundant, they will probably learn that because it's everywhere and they can find it. They won't spend time learning bottle gentian when they're surrounded by spotted knapweed or something like that. So I've been in places where the weedy plants are getting all the love from the pollinators, and it's kind of sad to see. Yeah, I mean they're flexible animals a lot of the times, especially for nectar. For pollen, some species are a little bit more specific, and for caterpillars, like which turn into butterflies. I know everybody loves butterflies, but people are not so fond of letting caterpillars eat plants. But so some caterpillar species tend to be pretty specific in terms of their host plants. But in terms of nectar, I would say that most bees and flies and wasps and butterflies and even hummingbirds are quite flexible for what they will visit. So you need to just keep in mind that insects, pollinators need a variety of habitats. So nectar for carbohydrates for energy, but also pollen for protein, amino acids. They also need nesting substrate. So some bees rely on raspberry canes. Some wasps rely on goldenrod stems, that kind of thing. And then also these host plants for butterfly larvae. So there's a lot going on. It's not as maybe simple as it might appear when you plant something like a lilac tree and you see things all over it. But also interestingly, things like magnolia, you won't see anything on it. So you do have cases where people, have brought over plants that are beautiful for a variety of reasons, but not native. And you'll notice that there's not a lot eating it or feeding off of them. So it is kind of interesting to walk around and make these observations. Magnolia is probably a bat pollinated plant because it's more from the south. But yeah, I always walk by these like beautiful magnolia trees and notice that there's not a ton flying around. I don't know, Lorraine, if you've noticed similar things.
Yes, absolutely. And I also think it's interesting to kind of be aware that visitation doesn't necessarily mean high value. And I think, Sheila's, your example of the non-native dandelion, that's a perfect example where, as you pointed out, you might see a lot of bees visiting, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're getting, in fact, in the study that Sheila just cited, it they're not getting what they need from that visitation. So I think there's a bit of a danger in equating insect visitation with oh, that plant is meeting all of their needs. It's, or that's a high quality source of nutrition for that insect. I think, I'll often hear from gardeners saying, wow, my, I don't know, butterfly bush, let's say. So that's a non-native plant that is often sold and promoted as a good plant for butterflies. So it's also an invasive species in a number of places in the States. It's often written about in the media. It's one of the first plants people think of when they think of supporting pollinators, is this non-native butterfly bush. And I often hear people saying, well, it's covered in butterflies visiting it. But if you put that into a bigger context of, pollinator value, well, this is actually an invasive species that is destroying habitat when it escapes into the wild and suppresses biodiversity and creates monoculture. So the fact that a whole pile of butterflies might be visiting your particular plant to get a sugar water blast of energy, that's one thing. But the bigger picture of the pollinator habitat that is negatively impacted by that non-native plant, so there are complexities to this, and I think it's important to just really say that in seeing a lot of bees or butterflies or whatever on a particular non-native plant does not necessarily make it a fantastic pollinator plant in the bigger picture.
Well, that's interesting because, yes, even the native nursery down here in Florida, they promote the butterfly bush.
Yeah, and introduced non-native species.
Let's switch. I'd like to talk about what about birds? We've talked about the bees. How do the birds benefit from native plants?
They benefit in a few ways. Some of them do feed off of nectar. So we have a few hummingbird species in North America. In the West, there are more than in the East. We mostly just have the ruby throated hummingbird, unless some hummingbirds get lost and end up on our side. And they have such high, I mean, they're so fast, right? So they have such high nectar needs, such high sugar needs. So they really rely on these plants that are high abundance, that have the right kind of flower length for their bills. So things like orange touch me not are really important. Some like tubular flowers that are sort of reddish or orange tend to be good hummingbird plants. Insects can't see red very well or white very well. So when you see those red flowers, they actually tend to be more bird pollinated. So we also talked about goldenrod in the fall, and goldenrod hosts all sorts of awesome insects, which are feeding off of it before they sleep for the winter. But that also means that the birds that are here for the summer and getting ready to migrate down to the south have an abundance of insects that are attracted to goldenrod to feed off of for their, long trips as well. So there's all sorts of things going on with goldenrod. A lot of birds are insectivores, especially declining birds in North America. So they require high insect abundances. Like they eat hundreds and hundreds of individuals a day, like swallows and those fast flying insectivorous birds. And then these native plants that are then pollinated produce fruit. And for some of the birds that will stay here into the fall and the winter, they're a really important food source of berries, and a food source for a lot of the resident birds as well. They'll switch to seeds and nuts, and not to mention small mammals as well. So there's a whole chain of reactions, I guess, that happen when native plants get pollinated. There's the insects get eaten, the flowers get eaten, the leaves get eaten, the stems get eaten, and all these different wildlife species are doing what they need to do to survive.
Yeah, and when you think about all of the, moth and butterfly caterpillars that have these specialist relationships with native plants, they're basically, native plants in providing, what's necessary for caterpillars have specialist relationships with particular native plants. They're basically just little bird factories, food factories for birds, that rely on those caterpillars, those little, well, just a very important food for birds. I think there's a lot of. Sheila mentioned, how folks are really keen on butterflies, but a bit less keen on the caterpillar stage of butterflies. People are very keen on birds and gardening to support birds, and it's just important to stress that what that means is you really, to support birds, you've got to garden for insects as well. You have to create habitat for insects, and that's very much what our book is about. And it's about gardening to support the insects, and those insects will then also support the birds, and on in this relational economy that's the way the ecosystems work.
Well, tell me then. Okay. So I've bought into this idea and I want to. I'm in Florida, but let's say I'm up there in New Hampshire, Michigan, that vicinity. Can you give me your top 3 or 5 plants that I can go out today and get and start with a little patch? What are a couple of your favorites that are really pretty that I might motivate me to plant more?
It's so hard to know where to start. So we've mentioned goldenrods and asters, and then 2 other genera of plants that are incredibly beautiful and incredibly supportive: pollen specialist bees, and also butterflies and moths in their larval stage. So we mentioned the goldenrod and asters, and the other top genera are rudbeckias. So you think of the beautiful black-eyed Susans, or the green headed coneflower. So the rudbeckias, and the native sunflowers. So the helianthus. And there's so many to choose from. The woodland sunflower if you have shade, or the tall sunflower. So many to choose from. So those are some of my favorites to recommend, mainly because they are the favorites of pollinators. Is ironweed. When we were talking about the non-native butterfly bush and how it's often promoted, and you think of those incredible kind of magenta flowers that are so striking on the non-native butterfly bush, well, ironweed, a native species, it's Vernonia is the Latin name. Ironweed has that same kind of magenta, purple, prolific flowers, blooms in the midsummer. That's one of my personal favorites. And Sheila, are you able? I don't know. I find it really hard to pick just a couple.
Yeah, I mean, I am not a good gardener. I know, because I co-author this book. And it's ridiculous. So for me, what I'm trying to figure out, what I would plant in a garden space, I really like shrubs. I really like early blooming shrubs. When people think about, pollinator gardens, they tend to think about things that are sort of blooming in June, July, and August. But for me, getting those insects fed first thing in the springtime is among the most important things for me. And shrubs need a lot less care and maintenance. And there's like hundreds of flowers on a single individual, which is awesome. So you don't need a ton of space either. So pussy willows, service berries, really any of the native berries that bloom early in the spring, any of the native fruit trees are just awesome. So that's where I would go if I had to plant like one thing. I would just try to figure out what's a local flowering shrub or tree that blooms early in the spring wherever I was. That's what I recommend.
Okay, now, I hear this all the time. Well, what about maintenance? Shouldn't they be easier to maintain? And what can I do to keep that time down so I can have my natives and joy of a little off time too?
It's true that native plants can be lower maintenance because of these they've adapted to, thousands and thousands of years of growing without human cultivation. When you think of how long they have evolved in an area. What is also really great about native plants and gardening for pollinators in terms of this question of maintenance is that most of the practices that are of benefit, most of the maintenance practices that are of benefit to pollinators are actually much easier for humans as well. So you think about maintenance practices. We've been taught in so many ways by traditional gardening that we have to quote unquote clean up our gardens in the fall. And nothing could be worse actually for pollinators. What we can do, which has the added benefit of being very low maintenance and great for pollinators, is leave the leaves where they fall. Leave them on garden beds. I mean, a big layer of leaves on a lawn will cause problems for the lawn, so you might have to shred them there. But in garden beds, leave those dead leaves as a mulch. Not only will it be less work, but you'll be providing habitat for all the many species that might overwinter in there in those dead leaves. You'll be, protecting the earth over the winter, protecting it from frost, heave, and cold, warm cycles and that kind of thing. And you'll be returning the nutrients to the soil as those leaves break down. Or another example is just in terms of, we're taught that we need to cut everything down in the fall. And again, that's, not only is it work for humans, but it's actually, it's not great for pollinators. So much better in terms of being lower maintenance and being better for pollinators is to leave those plant stocks standing over winter for any cavity nesting bees that might be nesting in the hollow or pithy stems of certain plants, such as the raspberry canes Sheila mentioned, or the insects that might overwinter in goldenrod stems, and on and on. These practices are, they're lower maintenance and they're better for pollinators. And so I think it's really a matter of training or maybe retraining, I don't know, starting to see the beauty and in that functional value of some of these practices.
Yeah, like almost always a native plant garden will be easier than keeping your lawn perfectly green and, through all the weather types, through drought. You don't have to mow it, you don't have to water it as frequently, that kind of thing. As Lorraine is alluding to, the trickiest part is getting people to view, these sort of, I don't even want to say messy because to me it's all very pretty, but something that looks more like a tall grass prairie or the floor of a forest and sort of a shade garden. To view that as beautiful as that perfectly mowed, perfectly green lawn. So that's the trickiest part for us, and that's what we're working towards.
Mm-hmm.
I'll say I actually got up early this morning and I had a stellar workout. I cleaned up. Well, cleaned up. I had to do a little bit of cleaning. I had to get the compost together, planted some plants, did some potting, and it was, just such a nice morning. And I've had a great workout to the point that's like, cancel that gym membership.
Yeah, I think we don't hear enough about the the kind of the well the physical benefits of gardening and as exercise and being outdoors, and then also the mental health benefits and the kind of human well-being and community well-being aspects of kind of creating habitat and gardening and doing something so positive in terms of, like, well, I know speaking personally, I feel very helpless and have moments of feeling very distraught about what's happening to the earth, about climate change and the biodiversity crisis, and feel quite helpless. And to actually go to let's say, I'm involved in a community garden. So to go there and to be tending the native plant, pollinator plantings around the food growing plots, that, that just helps me to feel like, okay, these huge problems, right in this little space, there's support for pollinators. We're doing something to support biodiversity. We're helping to create resilience on the landscape, which is so important in the context of climate change. That's what we need, and the native plant habitat spaces that we can care for, they're contributing to resiliency. So the kind of mental health benefits of that are they're really important, and we can feel those personally and immediately when we start doing something like habitat gardening with native plants.
Let me ask you, what was each of your favorite parts about writing this book? What did you learn new in compiling this book?
I guess for me, learning about the incredible numbers of specialist relationships that each of these native plants that we profile in the book has with, particularly with bees, native bees, and native butterflies, native moths, beetles, flies, learning, which species of insects, particular species of native plants have this specialist relationship with. Learning about that for me was just an incredible experience. And then being able, through the book, that we're able to share that with people, because I think, there's a lot of awareness in North America now, I would say, about the specialist relationship between monarchs and milkweed. Like, that information is now out there, and there's this groundswell of interest in planting milkweed, a native plant, and supporting monarchs, an endangered butterfly. Um, and I think what's less well known, and something that I think our book contributes to, helping people understand, is that the monarch and milkweed relationship is that specialist relationship can be found, with most native plants. And if we can just kind of expand that interest from and say, okay, there's this, we're supporting this monarch and milkweed relationship, that's amazing. What about some of the other, butterflies and moths and bees that have specialist relationships with other native plants? And wow, okay, let's think about planting those other plants as well. Let's create a habitat here. Let's build these relationships. And so, for me, helping kind of share information about those specialist relationships beyond the ones that are very familiar, like monarchs and milkweed. So helping to share that information and learning about those relationships was just an amazing experience.
Yeah, for me, it was as we were putting together some photos and trying to think about this book in a way so that it doesn't only talk to homeowners with a bright sunny front yard.
Mm-hmm.
I was just noticing the different ways that people were fitting in native plants and making their own pollinator gardens where they could. So whether it's on balconies, we have a picture in the book of someone who basically built a shelf over their garbage bins where they stored their garbage bins and then had some pots. And it was one of the nicest pollinator gardens in my neighborhood. Thinking about community gardens as pollinator gardens, or on major streets, those sort of planter boxes, getting cities to stuff those with native plants instead of, pansies or geraniums or whatever kind of constant flowering things that don't really produce anything of use to our native pollinators, but to like rethink these spaces and try to fit in pollinator plants as much as possible. And then we provide some examples in our book of which kinds of plants do well in those kinds of scenarios. So that's been really helpful for me to learn about, so that I can communicate that it's not just about, front yard pollinator garden. There's a lot of other options out there that we can fight for, even if we don't have access to space ourselves.
Oh yes,
Mhm.
that's a good point. You've got them, and you've got little plans for all kinds of spaces.
Yeah, we included garden designs, like sample garden designs in the book for a whole bunch of different scenarios. Like, okay, if you live in an apartment building and there's some common areas on the ground, here is a sample native plant habitat garden design for that space. Maybe you could get together with some neighbors to, talk to the building management about, having a pollinator habitat there in those shared areas, and we include specific plants in the designs. We have a sample design for a balcony pollinator garden with native plants. Include, plants that bloom from spring through summer through fall. Different plants for those seasons, so that there's always something in bloom for, because different pollinators have different life cycles and are active at different times. So having something in bloom throughout the growing season, or a couple of species in bloom throughout the growing season, is really important. So we took that into account. Sample designs, or for a community garden, or in a public park, or in a residential situation, a yard, sunny or shady. We include sample designs for all of those situations, which we hope really make it easy for people to get started. There's so many kind of different ways you can start the native plant habitat gardening journey, and that's one of the simplest ways, using those sample designs, or just flipping through, more than 300 different plants, saying, oh, I like the way that one looks, and what other species does it grow well with, and asking all of those sorts of questions.
Well, ladies, thank you so much for being here today. My cup of chai is just about gone, and I know we've taken up a lot of your time. This is an absolutely beautiful discovery from your publisher. I'm so happy Island Press did a wonderful job on this book. The photos, the illustrations, it just all really comes together. So let me ask the both of you, now that you've completed such a big project, what can we look forward to seeing from each of you next?
Go ahead, Lorraine.
Okay. Well, I've been doing a lot of, or mainly what I'm involved in right now has to do with giving presentations, and slideshows, and talking with people in, either gardening groups or environmental groups, or just, well, anyone who will have me. I'll speak with them about, native plants and pollinators and various other topics as well. And I guess then the other thing I'm very involved in now has to do with trying to advocate for change to municipal bylaws and ordinances, or HOA, restrictions that really get in the way of gardening and habitat, like gardening in a way to provide habitat for pollinators. So let's say ordinances or restrictions that HOAs might have that prevent you from leaving your leaves on your garden beds over the winter. So really trying to advocate to change those very anti-ecological ordinances and rules and bylaws and restrictions, so that we can really support biodiversity.
Yeah, it's so funny. Some of them are just so backwards. Like, you can't have anything in your front lawn taller than 10 centimeters, or Milkweed was listed as a noxious weed for so long, and it's such an
Mhm.
important native plant, at least in Ontario.
Yeah,
So there's
or
all
that
sorts of silly things that happen.
Yeah, or that so many people, I really just want to mention because we've talked about goldenrod so many times in our conversation, and there's just a misperception out there that goldenrod causes hay fever when it's ragweed that does that. So, some of these ordinances, some of these rules prohibit you from growing goldenrod when it's a great native plant that does not cause hay fever. Anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Sheila, but I just thought that was a perfect place to mention this
Yeah.
important thing.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, like Lorraine, I do lots of this education. It's really, it's taken more than a decade to have these conversations, but I think people are generally starting to get it, starting to appreciate some of these nuances and complexities a little bit more. My lab also does research around like honeybee competition with wild bees. And we're working towards getting Canada to have a national pollinator protection policy because there are many other countries that have this and we do not. The States actually does have pollinator policy, although it does tend to sort of favor managed honeybees and the monarchs more than any other species, but at least there's something. So I'm trying to work on the policy aspect of that. And then I also have a new website called findingflowers.ca, and it's an interactive garden website where we talk about relationships that people have with native plants and indigenous medicine plants and pollinators, and there's stories in there, and trying to help people connect a little bit more to their gardens in different ways. So definitely check that out.
Well, we will. I'll put all of these, excuse me, links to your websites, and you have other websites in your book too that you've listed: eButterfly, Bumblebee Watch. There's all kinds of website links in there with more information too, isn't there?
Yes,
Yes.
definitely. Bumblebee Watch is one of the best ways that people can help us find rare species of bumblebees. So if people are feeling inclined to take some photos, we would really appreciate that as well.
Well, ladies, thank you so much for being here today. And I want to let our listeners know that this book, they should buy it. This is awesome. And even if you live in the South, this is a great book to just have on your reference because a lot of plants, too, they have a pretty wide range and it's really interesting and a beautiful book. It is A Northern Gardener's Guide to Native Plants and Pollinators, Creating Habitat in the Northeast, Great Lakes, and Upper Midwest by Lorraine Johnson and Sheila Colla, illustrated by Ann Sanderson. And ladies, thank you so much for being here today to share all this great pollinator habitat news with us.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks so much.